be talking a bit about two readings, but I'm going to actually read the first reading, which is from 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. I suspect my version may not be quite the same as the one on the board, but I don't think that matters. You can then look at the differences and have a little debate in your heads about, Now the wife of a member of the company of prophets cried to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord, but a creditor has come to take my 2 children as slaves." Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" She answered, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." He said, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not just a few. Then go in and shut the door behind you, you and your children, and start pouring into all these vessels. When each is full, set it aside." So she left him and shut the door behind her and her children. And they kept bringing vessels to her, and she kept pouring. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." But he said to her, "There are no more." Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your children can live on the rest." Her husband is dead, and the creditors arrive to take her children into slavery. I don't know whether you have children or grandchildren or not, but I'm sure whether you do or you don't, you can imagine what that might feel like. What's the most precious thing? And there somebody is banging on the door saying, "I'm taking these away." It's a really big ouch, isn't it? So there's all the grief of the loss of a husband, and now there's all the grief of an incomprehensible situation of my children are going into slavery. Loss and grief can take many forms, and Joyce Rupp, in her book Praying Our Goodbyes, talks about it's not necessarily always just about the loss of a loved person, the loss of a job, the loss of being able to walk 4 miles, the loss of hearing and sight, the loss of being able to get out and about. All those things can be losses in our lives. And people often say to me, I was more upset when the dog died than I ever was when my sister or my partner died. And why are we surprised by that? Well, in a sense, we're not, are we? Because sometimes what happens is that the dog is a member of the family, but it also allows us permission to kind of explore and express our grief in a way that the death of somebody, is harder. I've got to be strong for the children. I have the privilege of volunteering in a hospice north of Portsmouth, and sometimes people share, I've got to be strong, they say to me. And I must put on a brave face, and I sort of say, well, it's okay, I'm in the room at the moment, and, we can cry as much as you like if you want to. And there's a sort of fear that if I start to cry, I won't ever stop. And there's a sense sometimes of, actually, why have you got to be strong? Because if we love people and care about them, then there is something about expressing that and sharing that. And I suppose one of my soapboxes for this century is that we don't do death. People don't die anymore, they pass away or pass on, almost a bit like they're a sort of luggage parcel that you pass from one person to another in a way. And we don't have any rituals for death in the way that other cultures perhaps do. So there's a sense to me that we've kind of lost something of how to grieve or how to allow ourselves that space to do that. And here, in this wonderful story of the woman, she goes to the prophet, Sometimes people go to church, sometimes they don't, as it were, well, I don't know how to deal with this, so what's your take on it, kind of thing. And Elisha says, what shall I do for you? So there's a real openness to, I'm not going to tell you that you need to do this, this, and this. If you clear, all his clothes, you'll feel better. You might not, So he doesn't say any of that. He just says, what can I do for you? And I think when we're journeying with people and doing that journey ourselves, that's often really important. And what do you have in the house? I mean, I love this question. It's fascinating, isn't it? Well, if somebody came to you and said, okay, things are really tough, and I'm really sorry you're going through all this grief, what do you have in the house? You'd think, well, they're barking mad, aren't they? Really? I've got some furniture and I've got some, bits and pieces and what have you. What do you have in the house? But it also reminds us that she had very little. There was nothing in the house because I guess she'd sold it all already, probably. Perhaps not on Free Cycle, but perhaps on Gumtree or whatever. And there, she says, I've got this tiny little pot of oil. And he says, right, okay, God can do something extraordinary with that. It reminds me a bit of the loaves and fishes story, that child with his picnic kind of thing, and out of that God feeds 5,000 people. Here, out of a tiny little pot of oil, she gathers in enough money. And all these vessels, people give their vessels. And, in my mind, I can picture, every kind of sort of shape of container that would have been handmade and around in those days. There'd have been tiny little pottery things and big pottery things and funny shaped things that, hadn't quite turned out okay. And this oil just keeps on flowing. And it doesn't stop until there are no more vessels. And as we think about our own losses and our own disappointments and our own grieving journey, and we think about Jesus as he heads towards the cross, this story is a story of hope, bringing hope out of despair and light into darkness. It's a story that reminds us that if we can just say, okay, I've got this, I can get through the next 10 minutes, then I've done 10 minutes again. Or I can get through the next hour, and then I've done 2 hours. And that can be the oil that God can take and just make extraordinary. And I guess the question, part of the question for us perhaps, is do we trust God with that? Joyce Rupp, in one of her books, Little Pieces of Light, says this: "O God, I wait in the unending darkness, like a chrysalis on a lonely limb. I am living in the dreadful in-between of death and life, of darkness and light, not coming, not going, just hanging on. I fight the seeming emptiness and struggle against required surrender. Teach me to wait patiently while my wings grow strong, for my time to fly has not yet come." There are those times in our grief journeys where we just have to wait. We have to wait patiently. We have to do, if you like, the grieving process. We can't rush it. It can't be hurried. And we have to take a deep breath at times. And we have to just say, okay, God, what have I got in my home? What have I got to give you? How can you bless me in this place of grieving, in this place of praying and saying goodbye? How can I trust you? And can I open myself up to actually our life is always one of journeying through that place of death and resurrection. You know, we're in Lent, and so we're kind of, in a sense, I'm thinking, well, we're talking about death, but we're not really, because every day, in each day of our lives, I think we do a little bit of dying and a little bit of rising. There's that sort of up and down that goes on through our lives in terms of that death and resurrection. And Joyce Rupp also says in Praying Our Goodbyes, the beauty of the Paschal mystery, the mystery of passing over from death to life, of moving from goodbye to hello, is that it ends with hello. That's the bit of oil that we hang on to, that it ends with hello. If Calvary is the deepest goodbye that anyone has ever known, then the resurrection is the greatest hello that anyone has ever proclaimed.